If you can waltz without stumbling, I'll marry you to my son." The words rang out like a cruel announcement from Edward Lancaster III, his booming voice carrying across the glittering ballroom of New York's high society. He lifted his half-empty glass of scotch and pointed it, not at a guest of honor, but at the young woman who had just dropped a tray of champagne flutes, shards scattering like fallen stars on the polished marble floor. The crash silenced the 200 guests gathered for the grand unveiling of Lancaster Group's newest skyscraper. Eyes turned in unison toward Amira Collins, 34, who had been quietly working as part of the contracted staff for only a few weeks. "Father, that's absurd," muttered Daniel Lancaster, 29, his face burning with shame at his father's cruelty. But Edward was drunk on more than whiskey. He was intoxicated with power, with the delight of humiliating those he considered beneath him. No, let's make this interesting," Edward declared, striding to the center of the room like a ringmaster ready to unveil his next spectacle. "This woman can't even carry a tray properly. Let's see if she can at least move to the rhythm of music." Amira stayed kneeling on the marble, carefully gathering the broken crystal with trembling hands. Yet her eyes betrayed none of the humiliation expected of her. Instead, they held a strange, steady fire, as if she were quietly measuring every laugh, every whisper, every sneer. "Sir, perhaps this isn't the time," the event coordinator began nervously. "Enough," Edward barked, cutting him off with a dramatic wave. "Play a waltz. If she can dance better than my wife, then my son will marry her." Imagine it, the heir of Lancaster fortune tied to the cleaning staff. What a scandal! Laughter rolled through the hall like thunder. Women covered their painted lips with gloved hands, pretending to be shocked, while men chuckled openly, enjoying the cruelty. Amira slowly rose to her feet, dusted her palms against her apron, and fixed her gaze on Edward Lancaster. The silence that followed stretched into something unbearable until her voice cut clean through the heavy air. "I accept." The room froze. Even the orchestra faltered, strings falling into silence. Edward blinked in disbelief, his smug smile faltering. "What did you just say?" "I said I accept your challenge," Amira repeated, her voice steady, her lips curved in the faintest smile. "But when I dance better than your wife, you'll keep your word." "Joke or not," gasps rippled across the room, followed by louder, nastier laughter. Guests believed they were about to witness the most humiliating scene of the season. Yet no one noticed the familiar spark igniting in Amira's eyes, the very same spark that once dazzled audiences across the grandest stages in Europe before one fateful night ended her career and cast her into obscurity. And so, as Victoria Lancaster, the 51-year-old socialite famed for teaching ballroom to Manhattan's elite, glided forward with a venomous smile, none of them had any idea how drastically the balance of power in that room was about to shift. "Darling, do you truly expect me to waste my time competing with that?" Victoria Lancaster sneered, flicking her manicured hand toward Amira as if brushing away dust. "Don't be so humble," Edward replied, his grin sharp with arrogance. "You took home the Waldorf Waltz Cup last year. That alone should be enough to put this demonstration to rest." Amira stood quietly, but her thoughts were already drifting far from the marble floor of the Lancaster ballroom. 15 years ago, she hadn't been Amira Collins the cleaner. She had been Amira Devereaux, principal dancer of the American National Ballet. Critics had hailed her as the future of the art form, the next great name to be written into history. She remembered ovations that shook opera houses, reviews that declared her untouchable, and the euphoria of flight as she leapt across the world's grandest stages. Then came the night everything was stolen. A gala performance for political elites. A late drive home. Headlights, the screech of tires. Darkness. 3 months in a coma. And the verdict of doctors who told her she should be grateful to walk again, but dancing professionally? Impossible. "Daniel," Edward snapped, turning to his son. "Fetch your phone. I want this moment captured forever. The day a maid dared to parade as a dancer at my event." Daniel shifted uneasily, his discomfort clear. "Father, enough. She was just doing her job. The girl," Edward cut him off, dripping with mockery, "accepted my challenge, and she will entertain us." Unless, of course, you'd prefer I mention that little mishap with your girlfriend last week? Daniel's face drained of color. Amira saw it instantly. Blackmail. Another reminder of the stranglehold Edward Lancaster had over everyone within his orbit. Music. Edward barked at the DJ. And let's make it fun. 500 on my wife to win, 1,000 for anyone foolish enough to back the help. Cruel laughter swept through the hall, a chorus of wealthy vultures circling their chosen prey. Some actually began pulling out wallets, eager to wager as though it were a game at the races. Victoria glided to the center of the floor, exaggerating her stretches like a peacock displaying its feathers. She tossed her hair back with a self-satisfied smirk, already imagining her victory. Edward leaned in close to Amira, his voice a whisper of venom. When you lose, and you will, you'll drop to your knees, beg forgiveness for wasting our time, and of course, you'll be fired. But instead of fear, something ancient and powerful flickered in Amira's eyes. It was the same force that had once propelled her across international stages. The same resilience that had carried her through excruciating therapy to take her first steps again. The same dignity that had kept her alive when her world had collapsed. "Mr. Lancaster," she said evenly, her calmness chilling some guests more than shouting ever could. "When I win, and I will, I'll hold you to your word about your son. But I also want something else." Edward raised an amused brow. "Oh, demands now? Very well. Indulge me. What else could you possibly want besides shackling yourself to my heir?" Amira let the silence stretch, her voice steady when it came. "I want you to admit, here and now, before all of them, that you judge me because of the color of my skin and the work I do. And then, I want a public apology." A ripple of unease passed through the room. The laughter softened, replaced by whispers and exchanged glances. The air grew heavy as guests realized this was no longer just a cruel joke. It was becoming something far more dangerous. Edward threw his head back and laughed, his arrogance filling the hall. "You've got audacity, I'll give you that. I'll give you that," Edward Lancaster sneered, his smirk cutting like glass. "Very well, I accept. But when you humiliate yourself in front of all these people, you'll leave here not only without a job, but stripped of every shred of dignity you thought you had." What Edward didn't realize was that the woman standing before him was not simply a cleaner with trembling hands. Amira Collins was someone who had already lost everything once and had clawed her way back, one painful inch at a time. She knew the weight of rejection, the sting of society's cruelty, and what it meant to fight for even the smallest scrap of respect. While Victoria Lancaster stretched, showing off her crisp ballroom posture like a smug performer rehearsing in front of a mirror, Amira stood utterly still at the edge of the floor. To the crowd, she appeared frozen, intimidated. But inside, her mind was a storm of precision. 15 years of brutal therapy, of relearning how to walk, of enduring the word impossible from doctors. Every step had forged a resilience none of these glittering elites could even imagine. "Look at her," whispered a jeweled guest to her companion. "She's probably never danced a day in her life. What cruelty!" Another chuckled. "This is unnecessary humiliation." Edward circled the room like a predator fattened on his own power, soaking in every laugh, every cruel whisper. With exaggerated showmanship, he raised his champagne flute. 500 says she can't make it through one song without stumbling. 1,000 if you believe she'll flee halfway through her little charade. Laughter erupted, bouncing off the high ceilings like an orchestra of cruelty. But Amira noticed something Edward missed. His son Daniel wasn't laughing. The young man stood awkwardly near the wall, shifting uncomfortably, refusing to meet the eyes of the guests. She remembered him now. 3 weeks ago, at her first event for Lancaster Holdings, he had been the only one who greeted the contract workers kindly. He had even carried a crate himself when no one else would bother. "Miss," came a voice low and gravelly at her side. Amira turned and saw a tall black man in his 60s, wearing the understated uniform of the building's security team. His name tag read, Marcus. He leaned close, pretending to adjust his earpiece. "I know you," he murmured so softly no one else could hear. 15 years ago. The National Theater. Amira Devereaux, principal soloist. Her heart clenched. Someone had recognized her. After years of anonymity, after burying her past beneath endless jobs and silence, here was a man who knew the truth. "I thought you died in that crash," Marcus continued, his voice hushed but heavy with awe. "The papers said you'd never dance again." "The papers said many things," Amira replied evenly, her pulse racing. "Not all of them true." Marcus's eyes softened with respect. "What happened to you was a crime, and what they're doing now." He glanced at Edward, still collecting bets with booming laughter, "is worse." In that moment, Amira felt the decision settle inside her like a final, steady heartbeat. For 15 years, she had hidden, living as a shadow of who she once was. But tonight, that ended. Tonight, she would reveal not just the dancer she had been, but the woman she had become. "Marcus," Amira said quietly, her voice steady but urgent. "I need a favor. When I dance, no matter what happens, you record everything, especially their faces." Marcus frowned, unsure. "Record it? Why?" For the first time that night, Amira's lips curved into a faint smile. "Because some people need reminding that underestimating someone can be the most expensive mistake they'll ever make." Across the room, Edward Lancaster decided to escalate his cruelty. Raising his glass, he shouted, "Let's make this even more entertaining, shall we? If she somehow manages to finish the song without collapsing, I'll give her $1,000. But when she fails, and she will, she'll scrub this ballroom clean." On her knees, in front of all of us, the reaction was a split chorus, laughter from some, uneasy murmurs from others. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, realizing the spectacle had crossed a line, but not one of them dared to oppose Edward Lancaster. "Father," Daniel spoke again, his voice tight with frustration. "This is too far." "Enough," Edward snapped, his face flushing red. "You're soft, Daniel. This is why you'll never understand power. There's a hierarchy in life, and people like her," he pointed a finger at Amira like a dagger, "must never forget their place." But Amira had already begun to move. Not to take her mark on the floor, but to stretch. Subtle, fluid motions, barely noticeable to the untrained eye. Yet Marcus recognized them instantly. His breath caught in his chest. "My God," he whispered under his breath. "She's really going to do it." Sensing the shift in attention, Victoria Lancaster swept onto the floor before it could turn fully toward her rival. "Start the music," she demanded, her tone commanding. "Let's end this farce quickly." The DJ, visibly uneasy, pressed play on a classical waltz. Victoria launched into her performance, polished, rehearsed, but predictable. Her steps were crisp, her posture textbook, the kind of ballroom precision money could buy from elite private tutors. The crowd clapped politely, but their applause was more for what she represented than how she moved. Wealth, pedigree, and social perfection. "Well done, darling," Edward called, clapping far too loudly. "And now, our guest." Amira stepped forward. Each stride carried weight, deliberate and graceful, her head held high. The quiet dignity in her movements unsettled more than one guest. She was not behaving like a woman destined for humiliation. "What will it be?" the DJ asked hesitantly. "Any song you'd like." "The same," Amira replied softly. "From the beginning." Edward laughed, savoring the mockery. "Oh, she wants another chance. How charming." He lifted his glass again. "Play it. Let's see how long before she runs out of courage." But none of them, not Edward, not Victoria, not the hundreds watching, realized that Amira had chosen her battlefield with precision. That particular waltz was no accident. It was the same piece she had danced countless times at the height of her career. A song etched into her muscles, her soul, her very bones. And as the first notes began to fill the hall, Amira's fingers twitched slightly, the subtle beginning of something none of them could have possibly expected. The accident. The night her destiny had shattered. Just hours before, Amira Devereaux had received a 5-minute standing ovation at the National Theater. a performance critics hailed as transcendent, one of the most hauntingly emotional displays in the history of American dance. Now, standing in the glittering ballroom 15 years later, she closed her eyes as the music prepared to rise. In an instant, she was back on that stage, flying, weightless, every muscle in harmony with the orchestra, every note woven into her very soul. The doctors had sworn she would never dance again. The newspapers had written her obituary as an artist. And for years, she believed them. She had buried her brilliance, convinced it was gone forever. Yet in private, alone, in the still hours of grief, she had kept moving. Slowly, painfully, rebuilding not only her body, but her unbreakable bond with dance. She had never returned to the stage, never sought the spotlight. Until now. The first notes of the waltz floated through the hall. Amira inhaled deeply, her hands lifting with such deliberate precision that even the orchestra faltered for a moment, instinctively recognizing the language of mastery. Something was happening, something none of these people had expected. And then she moved. It was not the awkward shuffle they had braced themselves for. It was as if gravity itself bent to her will. She rose, gliding with such grace that the very air seemed to soften. At first, her movements were restrained, almost modest, lulling the audience into a false sense of security. But as the music swelled, so did she. Step by step, turn by turn, her body began to sing. The laughter died. Edward Lancaster froze, his grin dissolving into disbelief. Victoria's self-satisfied smirk melted into something closer to panic. And all around them, the glittering crowd realized they were not watching a maid fumbling through a dance. They were witnessing an artist reclaim her throne. "My God," someone gasped. "She's extraordinary." Amira launched into a sequence of pirouettes that spun with breathtaking speed, her balance unshakable, her expression serene. She leapt into a soaring grand jeté, her body suspended midair with such lightness that time itself seemed to hesitate. These were not ballroom steps. This was ballet of the highest order, refined, devastating, transcendent. Marcus, true to his word, angled his phone to capture everything. The dance, yes, but more importantly, the faces. The awe, the disbelief. The terror etched into Edward Lancaster's features as his smug cruelty was stripped bare. "This is impossible," Edward muttered under his breath, voice trembling. "Who is this woman?" Gasps rippled through the crowd as Amira shifted seamlessly into a breathtaking sequence. The very choreography that had once been her signature, a unique fusion of classical ballet and modern innovation she had pioneered herself. To those who knew, it was unmistakable. "Wait," said a woman in pearls, a patron of the arts whose name graced every gala program in the city. Her voice trembled. "I know those movements. I've seen that sequence before. But it can't be." Across the room, Daniel Lancaster stood motionless, his phone raised. But unlike his father, his expression wasn't horror. It was reverence. He recognized genius for what it was, no matter who embodied it. As the music thundered toward its climax, Amira spun into a storm of fouettes, endless turns, flawless, fierce, her body a blur of grace and precision. The hall fell utterly silent, transfixed, as the myth of the cleaning woman burned away before their eyes. What they were seeing was not humiliation. It was resurrection. These were movements that demanded more than flawless technique. They required a lifetime of discipline, the strength of steel, and the soul of an artist who had suffered and risen again. As the final note of the waltz lingered in the air, Amira Devereaux froze in her closing pose. Her arms stretched outward, her chin lifted high, her body radiating dignity. There was power in her stillness, but also vulnerability, the kind that comes only from baring one's soul. Her breath was steady, measured, as if she had not just shattered every expectation in the room. The silence that followed was deafening. It was the rare, electric silence that comes only when an audience has witnessed something beyond entertainment, something transcendent. Then, a single pair of hands began to clap. Another joined. Within seconds, the hall erupted, hundreds rising to their feet, their applause a thunder that rattled the very windows. "Bravo!" shouted a voice. "Magnificent!" echoed another. The ovation surged like a tidal wave, drowning out every trace of mockery that had existed minutes before. Edward Lancaster stood pale, his face ashen, his lips trembling. The titan of Manhattan society had been dismantled in front of his peers, not by a rival tycoon, but by the very woman he had tried to humiliate. Now those same peers stared at him with disdain, even pity. His power, so carefully cultivated, was cracking before their eyes. At that moment, Marcus stepped forward, still recording on his phone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying through the hall, "permit me to introduce Amira Devereaux, former principal soloist of the American National Ballet." The name landed like an explosion. Gasps filled the ballroom. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. For those who had followed the arts, it was like seeing a ghost resurrected. "Impossible," Victoria Lancaster stammered, her face drained of color. "Amira Devereaux is dead. Or at the very least, she never danced again after that accident." "Clearly," Amira replied at last, her voice calm, her lips curving into a wry smile. "The rumors of my death were greatly exaggerated." Laughter burst from the audience, not cruel this time, but joyous, cathartic, as if they themselves were relieved to discover the legend lived. But Edward did not laugh. He looked gutted and furious. He had mocked not just a woman, he had mocked a name revered in American culture. And worse, it was all captured on film. "Mr. Lancaster," Marcus said, still holding the phone aloft, "you declared before all of us that if she danced better than your wife, you would marry her to your son. I believe everyone here can attest that she has exceeded that condition in every possible way." Daniel stepped forward then, his voice firm despite the weight of the moment. "Miss Devereaux," he said, bowing his head slightly, "I wish to apologize for my father's cruelty. His behavior tonight was inexcusable." "Daniel!" "Enough," Edward roared, his composure unraveling completely. "You will not apologize, least of all to her." But Amira's calm voice sliced cleanly through his rage. "On the contrary, Mr. Lancaster, I believe you and I have a marriage contract to discuss. After all, a man of your stature would never go back on his word." Would he? The audience hushed instantly. They understood they were no longer simply witnesses to a spectacle. They were standing in the middle of a reckoning. "You must be out of your mind if you think I'll honor some drunken jest," Edward snarled, his arrogance rearing up again, desperate and flailing. "Oh, but it wasn't a jest," Amira said, her eyes glinting. "Marcus, if you would?" Marcus lifted his phone, pressing play. The room filled with Edward's own voice, slurred with whiskey, cruel and unrelenting, declaring the bet, raising the stakes, demanding her humiliation. The recording caught every word, even the moment when Amira had clarified, "And you will keep your word, even if this was spoken as a joke?" And his smug voice confirming, "Yes." Gasps, whispers, nervous laughter. Faces turned toward Edward, no longer admiring, but condemning. "That's blackmail," Edward shouted, his face twisted with rage. "No," Amira corrected, her tone calm, steady, unshakable. "This is called accountability. You made a public bet, Mr. Lancaster, in front of 200 witnesses," Amira said firmly. "Now the choice is yours. Prove you are a man of your word, or reveal to the world that your pride is worth more than your honor." The room grew still again. Then, unexpectedly, Daniel stepped closer to her. His voice was steady, carrying across the hushed hall. "Miss Devereaux," he said, meeting her eyes, "if you will allow me, I would like to fulfill my father's promise. Not because I am forced into it, but because any man should consider it a privilege to stand beside a woman of your strength and dignity." Gasps and murmurs swept through the hall. No one had expected a declaration like that. Edward's face turned crimson. His hands shook as rage consumed him. "Daniel, if you go through with this, you're finished. You'll lose the company, the inheritance, the family name, everything." Daniel didn't flinch. He extended his hand toward Amira. Then so be it. Some things matter more than wealth. Integrity, for one. The crowd whispered in awe, watching the young heir defy his father's tyranny. Amira glanced at the hand, then at the audience, then back at Edward Lancaster, whose fury was unraveling into something like a breakdown. Finally, she spoke, her voice rich with quiet strength. "Mr. Lancaster, 15 years ago people like you decided I was worthless the moment I became imperfect. Tonight, you tried to strip me of dignity because of the color of my skin and the work I do to survive. But here's the truth I've learned. Nobility is not in titles or fortune. It is measured by how we treat one another when there's no applause, no cameras, no one to impress." She turned to Daniel, her expression softening. "Your son, despite your best efforts, seems to understand that. As for your so-called proposal," she smiled faintly, "I'll accept dinner with him. But marriage, well, that's a choice two people make freely, not something born of humiliation and arrogance." Applause thundered through the hall again. But this time, it wasn't only for the brilliance of her performance, it was for the dignity she carried in the face of cruelty. Edward stood frozen, his empire of reputation crumbling before his eyes. He muttered something about letting lawyers handle it and stormed out, Victoria trailing behind him, her face pale with shame. Marcus finally lowered his phone, grinning as he joined Amira. "This is going to explode when it hits social media," he whispered. And explode it did. Within hours, the video spread across every platform, climbing to millions of views. By the next day, the world was watching one story dominate the headlines. Billionaire humiliates legendary ballerina and loses everything. But what the public saw wasn't only a scandal. It was a story about prejudice exposed, arrogance shattered, and the reminder that true class isn't bought, it's lived. The next morning, Edward Lancaster woke to a nightmare he couldn't escape. Overnight, 3 major contracts worth millions had vanished. His partners demanded an emergency meeting, shareholders were in revolt, and headlines screamed his downfall across every front page. Even Victoria had locked herself away, refusing to be seen in public. "Father," Daniel said when he stepped into the office, finding Edward surrounded by scattered newspapers and empty glasses, his face pale with defeat. "The board has voted. You have 1 hour to resign, or they'll remove you." Edward's voice was barely more than a whisper, trembling with fury. You did this. You betrayed me." Daniel met his gaze with calm steel. "No, father. You betrayed yourself the moment you chose arrogance over humanity." Meanwhile, Amira was flooded with opportunities. 3 world-renowned ballet companies invited her to choreograph new productions. Lincoln Center offered her a headline solo event. Hollywood producers fought for the rights to her story. But the offer that moved her to tears came not from the powerful, but from the children at the small community school where she had once taught. They pooled together $27 in coins and crumpled bills. "To help you teach again," their letter read. Amira smiled through tears. "I'll accept. But on one condition, we turn this into something greater." 6 months later, the Amira Devereaux Center for the Arts opened in the heart of Manhattan, built on global donations inspired by her story. The grand opening drew crowds from across the world. And the very first major donor? Daniel Lancaster, who had reshaped the family business into one driven by social responsibility, proving that change was possible even in the most rigid of legacies. Edward, however, had lost everything: his empire, his reputation, even his family. Victoria filed for divorce and moved abroad. The once mighty mogul was last seen working as a low-level consultant, a shadow of the man who once believed wealth gave him the power to degrade others. At the center's opening, Marcus leaned against the wall, filming the moment as children of every background twirled and laughed in Amira's first beginner ballet class. "You know what amazes me most about this story?" he said. "It's not just a triumph over prejudice. It's a lesson in how true nobility responds to cruelty." Amira smiled as she guided a young girl through her first graceful steps. "Sometimes," she said softly, "we have to lose everything to discover who we really are." And sometimes, people must lose everything to realize who they should never have become. Just then, Daniel approached with a bouquet of wildflowers he had grown in the gardens he planted around the center himself. "Dinner?" he asked, extending his arm. "Dinner," she replied, accepting his arm, and with it, a new life built not on revenge, but renewal. Because Amira's greatest triumph wasn't in tearing Edward down. It was in building something so luminous, so inspiring, that his cruelty faded into irrelevance. She proved that when we face prejudice with dignity and transform hatred into excellence, we don't just win, we change the world around us. And now, I want to ask you, have you ever faced someone who tried to diminish your dreams because of who you are? Share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us the best revenge is to live extraordinarily.